The Pine&Oak podcast with Alon, Pinkas and Amir, Oren is being created at the Procast Studios in Tel Aviv. Procast is a leading podcast house dealing with commercial as well as public interest issues in Israel and in the region. Hello again for the second episode of Pine&Oak, the podcast dealing with American-Israeli relations and various other subjects. And Alon, Pinkas, my co-host, we have doubled the number of episodes.
Yes.
In 1 week. It's a tremendous pace, or as President Trump would have said, wonderful, extraordinary. So we are dealing with Gaza and the hostage deal, but if I remember correctly, you, as well as I, had a lot of touch with the Pentagon even before the incoming or at least the designated chairman of the Joint Chiefs graduated from the Virginia Military Institute. How do you see the Pentagon purge of General C.Q. Brown, the Chief of Naval Operations Franchetti, and the Judge Advocate Generals?
It's a night of long knives in that respect. First of all, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs apparently, well, it's not only the precedent that you don't dismiss him and you allow him to complete his term irrespective of who is president. It's that Mr. Trump's rationale came out, and apparently it has to do with a video that General Brown issued, the four-star general, ex-pilot, fighter pilot, issued after the murder of Floyd. And the things he said there, and when he recalled how he felt being the only black in the squadron, and then the only black amongst his graduating class, only black in the Joint Chiefs. Then
Wait, hold on for a second. Let's remind ourselves and perhaps our viewers and listeners. Up until the late 1940s, the armed forces were segregated. It was only because President Truman ordered the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines to integrate blacks into their ranks. Of course, in World War II, there were separate Afro-American battalions and squadrons.
Like the famous Tuskegee squadron of fighter pilots.
Right, whose survivors are now being laid to rest. The 100 or so year old veterans. So there was resistance to begin with in the services to blacks, and what you recount is what General Brown did in a previous post when he was the commanding general of the Far East Air Force squadrons, and only then did President Biden appoint him chairman of the Joint Chiefs after President Trump appointed him Air Force chief. So why all of a sudden did he recall that incident?
Because, no, it's not that he recalled the incidents. It's that Trump noticed, or it was brought to his attention, that when George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, General Brown came out with a 4-minute video protesting the general attitude and the general approach to blacks.
But that too is for a reason. Yes, Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs under President George H.W. Bush, and for several months under Bill Clinton too. but there are not too many role models for black youth. And if the armed forces want and really need to recruit whoever is eligible, because as you know, almost one half of Americans between 17 and 22 or so are overweight and cannot compete for entry-level positions in the military. If you exclude blacks and then Hispanics and then women, who are you going to be left with?
You'll end up with some militias in the mountains in Idaho.
Right.
Or some motorcycle gangs in Alabama or Louisiana.
Proud Boys.
The Proud Boys are not exactly. They may be proud and they may be boys. They're not exactly military material. But look, you're right. You look at American history. You look at Vietnam, and in Vietnam, two things coincided. The war in Vietnam, obviously, but also the riots in major American cities, and the Black Panthers and
race riots,
of course. And in Vietnam era movies, in many Vietnam era movies, not Vietnam era movies about the Vietnam War, there's always that line about why are we blacks fighting the white man's war against the yellow people who did us no harm, who never enslaved us, who never had anything to do with us.
And you had Baba in Forrest Gump.
And you had Baba in Forrest Gump. And so, it would have been tempting to accuse Trump of blatant racism. But then he also fired Lisa Franchetti, the chief of naval operations, the first ever female officer.
A few days after firing Linda Fagan, the head of the Coast Guard, which is not part of the military,
right,
it's Homeland Security, used to be transportation, but it's really similar.
It's a major force. It's not one of the three branches, but it's a major force.
Right.
And then
there's a bias there.
And then you look at the common denominator.
Right.
He fires a black general, then he fires a female admiral, then he fires the three judge advocate generals of the three branches, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And you're saying this is eerily reminiscent of what Trump is about. He does not like blacks, he does not like women, and he does not like
lawyers
or legal counsels. And he fired all of them, also firing the deputy commander of the Air Force. And we don't know where this is going to end. And reminding you, of course, but for our listeners and viewers, that he also took out the photos of the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, and removed his security clearance and also his security detail. And he did so to several, but Milley is obviously the most conspicuous one. And you're saying, okay, there is a pattern here. And at the head of the Pentagon is a gentleman, not exactly a field marshal, nor a guy with a military background, but not exactly a military philosopher.
A captain or a major, yeah.
Pete Hegseth. And you're saying, okay, he's doing in the Pentagon what he is doing elsewhere. The big question here is whether or not he's going to allow, and I know I'm digressing from the issue that you raised, is he going to allow DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, Elon Musk and his minions to go for the Pentagon?
Now, he already stated and then backtracked for at least some distance. At first, he said that he's going to cut $50 billion a year, 8% of the defense budget. And then he said, no, I meant only to refocus some of the line items in the budget so that we will emphasize other stuff than what Biden did. The word Biden of course, is anathema. Anything Biden touched used to be Obama.
It used to be exactly.
So anything Biden did is a no-no now. It doesn't seem that the American military machine, having been so shell-shocked because of the firing of these senior officers, because many thousands have been given notice that they could be fired, and those who are considered probationary, less than 2 years with the department, are out already.
Yeah.
How can they fight? How can they now go to war, let's say, against Iran?
The assumption is that they're going to use technological superiority against Iran rather than armored divisions, or that they're going to use long-range missiles and cruise missiles.
But there is always a man in the loop.
You're asking a rhetorical question. He is diminishing America's capability to wage wars.
But all of the while he's saying that he's for the warrior ethos and for deterrence. How can you deter if your military is not credible?
He's for a Confederate military ethos. He thinks about Stonewall Jackson or Robert E. Lee. He's not thinking about Charles Brown or Lisa Franchetti.
And as part of that, the Defense Secretary Hegseth wanted to go back to Fort Bragg, which is indeed a storied post where the airborne and the special forces have been for a long time, the 82nd Airborne, the Green Berets. But Braxton Bragg was a Confederate general. So it's not politically correct to go back to Braxton Bragg. He found someone named Bragg who was a rifleman in World War II.
And it was named after him.
And now it's renamed Bragg, but it's not that Bragg.
Right.
But he
the same way that the road just next to the Pentagon, Lee Highway, could be renamed after Lee Majors, the $6 million man.
So,
yeah,
but
sure.
now Hegseth has bragging rights in Virginia and
you can always
other places. So what's going to happen? We all grew up on the traditions of the U.S. military. Of course, sometimes they were very cumbersome. It's very, very slow moving this heavy machine. But nevertheless, they were never so out of joint. They lost their equilibrium.
But you have to put it in a broader context, which is more worrying than what you just said, which is worrying enough. And that is that Trump, essentially, at his core, is an agent of chaos. There's no objective or end to this chaos, but chaos itself.
Well, the objective is to get a deal.
What deal? It doesn't matter. Any deal. He's an agent of chaos. So he's undermining alliances, NATO, the Far East, and including soon to be announced in the Middle East. And you wrote about this yesterday, if I recall. He is confronting allies, Denmark over Greenland, Canada and Mexico over tariffs, Jordan and Egypt over their reluctance to accept 2.3 million Palestinians.
And NATO in general.
NATO is the be-all and end-all of this, to the point that if you are a curious, smart woman living in Amsterdam or Taipei, Seoul or Toronto, and you look at Donald Trump, and then you look at Xi Jinping, and the president of China, and even Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, you don't necessarily see a difference in terms of who guarantees a stable world. Now, the same thing he's doing domestically by weakening the American. He has no concept of the military. reminding everyone watching, listening to us, that this man dodged the draft in Vietnam because he had a bone spur and a foot spur,
Unfortunately.
Very unfortunate. And so if you recall his statement during the election, that he admires Hitler's generals because they were loyal, and his frequent confrontations and clashes with Milley and other generals in the Pentagon.
My generals,
certainly after January 6, 2021, when the military basically, and the Secretary of Defense, Mike Esper, refused to commit the military to join in this insurrection. And so he's an agent of chaos, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that he's also undermining the American military. Because going back to the beginning of our conversation, if you're an African American and you see what he did to General Brown, and if you are a female, a woman in America, and you see what he has done to Lisa Franchetti, you would think twice before seeking a career in the military.
Because he says, and he, meaning Trump, but also Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, that merit should take precedence over affirmative action, as if all of these female officers and black officers were not worthy of the positions.
Right. So America needs more Hegseth and Trumps than Franchetti and Brown. Fine. That's how you lose all credibility in the world. The world no longer sees America. We are having this podcast, and we will in the next weeks and months. We are in the midst of structural change, tectonic shifts in the world order. They usually take time, and they will take time, but this is at an accelerated pace.
So here
we are not talking about the same America that you and I talked for years, and until 6 months ago, for that matter, or 3 months ago.
So we have no basis to predict what's going to come, but we'll do it anyway. Okay. Here we are sitting in Tel Aviv, watching Trump's priorities, the southwest border, for instance. And then he is willing to sell the Ukraine down the river.
Already sold.
And we also have a river, Jordan. Hopefully, we won't be sold down.
Major river.
Yes, but so many Gospels had it as their theme. And what are we here in Israel to think of such a commander-in-chief who doesn't seem to have a basic doctrine? He's swinging it. And if he does have a concept, it is that might makes right. Putin, the aggressor, should be conceded to. Yeah. Because otherwise the Ukraine war would go on for years. The United States would have to pour its treasury into it.
Yep.
So better to cut a deal.
Yeah, but let me reverse this. The Europeans should cut a deal with Putin and China and isolate America. They keep on thinking in 1945 and post-1945 terms. They keep on being sort of enslaved to American foreign policy, towing the line. And what we need to see is that a changing world order and an unpredictable, transactional, fickle commander-in-chief or realtor-in-chief, if you look at his Gaza and Greenland and Panama Canal ideas, we need to take into consideration the possibility that we can no longer rely or depend on America. Now, that may not be a bad thing, as you yourself wrote yesterday, but what I'm saying is we have no real levers of power.
But 3 generations of Israelis, as well as other foreigners, quote unquote, if one looks at it from Washington or Houston or any other American city or rural area. 3 generations have grown up on the idea that Americans are no longer isolationists because they learned after World War II the lesson of what happened after World War I, when the Republicans in the Senate blocked President Wilson's efforts to have the U.S. join and lead the League of Nations. And of course, the result was the 1930s, Nazism, fascism, Stalin, and the Second World War. So after the Second World War, Republicans joined hands with the Democratic administration for the Marshall Plan, for NATO, and they understood that investing a taxpayer's dollar abroad can buy security for the United States.
Not anymore.
Trump doesn't seem to understand
Not
it.
anymore, and most Americans don't. Not because they think about it so much, but because they haven't seen any benefits to this. He sold them a story that investing in NATO is not beneficial, not advantageous to the U.S., and they understand that intuitively. Then he throws at them these big numbers, and they say, yeah, it's just too much. Why should we? And then he goes on and says that all defense expenditure, and particularly military aid, which is where Israel fits in, should be in the form of loans rather than grants, should be repaid rather than awarded.
Lee rather than grant, if you want
exactly.
your Civil War metaphor.
Exactly. Now, you're looking right now at a president who's a imperialist mercantilist, in the sense that it's all about resources and money.
And he is transactional.
And profit, which means that the world is now divided into three economic blocks. The U.S., I no longer count Canada and Mexico with the U.S. It's not it's not NAFTA, North America, or it's the
Free
U.S.
trade
It's the U.S. Then there's the European Union, which is, by the way, in terms of population and total combined GDP, bigger than the U.S. And there's China. Now, if this is all about transactional economics, then why would South Korea and Japan keep aligning themselves with an increasingly undependable and unreliable America?
But if they don't, and you may count Germany too, why won't they go nuclear?
They will go nuclear. That is something that I've written about, saying if I were Taiwan, if I look at the Ukrainians, they are now repentant on their decision in 1994 to disarm from
for not being Ukraine.
Exactly. But if you are Japan, by the way, Japan and South Korea, and for that matter, Australia and Canada, are what we call usually in the Iranian context threshold states. They have the technology, they have the hardware, they have the enriched uranium.
It's a matter of political will of decision.
It's a complete, and they're much closer than any than South Africa is in that respect. Germany for sure, but Germany may still have inhibitions and
not after these elections.
Maybe not. Maybe these, yes, but the next ones.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. So, if no one is going to take America seriously anymore, and if the Marshall Plan is just a something in history that no longer is relevant, and NATO is going to be undermined, two things can happen. Either the agent of chaos will succeed in creating chaos, and you will see that if there are regional conflicts, he will not get involved. You know, the days of getting involved in Iraq and Afghanistan and Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Israel, Yemen, that's not going to happen.
So if we go back 16 months, right after October the 7th, Biden came out with his famous don't was meant at Israel and, of course, at Iran and Hezbollah too.
Right.
And then he sent his 2 aircraft carrier task forces, later the THAAD battery to Israel. All of that probably President Trump won't do because he wants to reduce American military footprint around the world.
And I understand why he's doing it. And he was voted amongst, and in his defense, it should be said that he said he would do this in the 2016 election, again in 2020, and most importantly in 2024. He said that, which is where Israel figures in. and this is
Right.
we're in Tel Aviv right now, you and I. Israel, as difficult as it is to admit it, Israel has no value to the U.S. as long as Trump is running the America along these lines: transactional, economic, beneficial,
Emotions, values.
none of the above. Biden had emotions, and he showed and he expressed and exuded weakness toward Israel for other reasons. Israel has no value to America at this point. Saudi Arabia does, Qatar does, the Emirates do, Japan does, South Korea does, arguably Taiwan does.
So when President Kennedy, in his famous speech, said, "Don't ask what your country can do for you," Trump is asking Israelis, or telling Israel, "Don't ask what my country can do for you.
Right.
I want to know what your country can do for me."
Yes, and for the last 25 years, there was a watershed moment in the U.S.-Israeli relationship that was sort of not dramatic at the time, but now you look at it in retrospect, and it was dramatic. And that's the disintegration or the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Because there is a myth that we reversed engineer the relationship with America as if already as early as Mount Sinai. On the 11th commandment was thou shalt respect and nourish the American-Israeli relationship. Okay, that's not the case. The U.S. was very was indifferent and then hostile to Israel well into the 60s. It wasn't until
Standoffish.
Standoffish is a good word. It wasn't until Nasser gave a negative answer to Kennedy's overtures to create some kind of an anti-Soviet containment bloc in the Middle East that Kennedy decided to hedge his bets and sold an advanced defense system, the Hawk anti-aircraft missile, to Ben-Gurion. And it was the first time that an Israeli prime minister met the president, and it wasn't even in the White House. It was at
Waldorf Astoria.
the Waldorf Astoria, which 10 years later was managed by a gentleman named Alon Ben-Gurion, Ben-Gurion's grandson. Now, then it evolved into a strategic relationship. And even then it was against the background of A, the Cold War, but B, more specifically, the Vietnam War. When the U.S. made a decision to sell Skyhawk A4 and Phantom F4 fighters to Israel, it was a major upgrade, a game changer, a force multiplier in terms of the Israeli Air Force and Israel's deterrence power. But that was after 1967. The pledge was made by Johnson slightly before, but they were delivered. And the Americans needed them because the Egyptians and the North Vietnamese army were both using SA-2 surface-to-air missiles 2 and SA-3 Soviet-made. And the U.S. This wasn't.
But fast forward just a couple of decades, and in the 1990s, under Reagan, with Cap Weinberger as Secretary of Defense, there was a heated debate between Washington and Jerusalem regarding the nature of the strategic relationship. The Americans insisted that it would be anti-Soviet and not anti-Arab, and Israel, of course, didn't want to clash with the Soviet Union, and it wanted help against the Arabs.
Exactly. And you recall that period, and it also coincided with the Pollard affair that raised a lot of eyebrows and a lot of suspicion and a lot of bad blood that flew in the Potomac, another of our rivers in this show. But I go back to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union disintegrates, and Israel still thinks it has strategic value to the U.S. The term Israel is a strategic asset is a term that was used by Israelis, not by Americans. The Americans, because it made political sense as the evangelical Christians became the major voting bloc.
No, let me put in a footnote. We mentioned General C.Q. Brown, who was the Air Force chief and then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Earlier, there was a previous General Brown, George Brown, an Air Force chief and then chairman, and he was trapped in an interview with a journalist with an Israeli background. He was an American at that time, who asked him whether Israel is an asset or a burden to American national security. And he fell into the trap and said that Israel is more of a burden.
Yeah.
This is where the asset versus burden
Right.
equation came from.
Right. Now, absolutely right. And you had George Bull at the State Department, and
He was right, by the way. George Bull saying that Israel should be saved in spite of itself.
And exactly. And then came that book by Walton Mersheimer about the
lobby.
Israel lobby, the hijacking American foreign policy to serve Israeli interests. And you take the cumulative effect of all those, and there was a revisionist thought in the U.S. Now, for political reasons, it never surfaced into the congressional level, let alone the presidential level. So Israel assumed that everything is okay. Now, when you ask yourself, what is Israel's value to the U.S. during a Trump administration? Okay? Israel doesn't have oil. Israel can't commit.
Rare minerals.
Israel doesn't have $15 trillion worth of rare minerals like the Ukrainians do,
Right.
which, by the way, is sort of a fake news because half of it, at least half of it, is in areas that are controlled by the Russians, which is going to very soon complicate Trump's life when he thinks that he can negotiate with Putin these minerals. Zelensky can give him all he wants, but it's right under the feet.
But Israel has Israelis. No other country
Israel
does.
has Israelis. That is right. And so for many years, we sold the concept of counterterrorism. And then came 9/11. And again, Israel was elevated into a sort of an asset in terms of how do you combat terrorism, how do you join information, how do you share intelligence, etc. But that was 20 years ago, 23 years ago.
Not only that, but even starting earlier in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Israel lost its veneer of expertise. When American officers started being stationed in Saudi Arabia, flying over it, Southern Watch, Northern Watch, they became area experts, at least as good as Israelis. Israelis were not in Saudi Arabia. Israelis watched Saudi Arabia and other places. So the current generation of American officers do not feel inferior to Israelis.
Not at all, which again raises our eyebrows collectively and individually. When American generals like David Petraeus and as well as others, and even the defense secretary at the time, Lloyd Austin, under Biden, warn Israel of the dangers of urban warfare in Gaza, saying they had a similar experience and made mistakes that Israel should be thankful to have the opportunity to learn from in Fallujah. And the Israeli generals responsible for the worst calamity in Israel's history on October 7th dismiss them offhandedly and say, don't tell us because we know Gaza.
But let me comment on that. Of course, professionally, the American generals were right. And this, again, goes to the doctrine that Petraeus and Marine General Mattis wrote regarding counterinsurgency. It is bad policy to kill one terrorist and have collateral damage and therefore produce 10 future terrorists. However, it is true that 3,000 casualties were caused by 9/11. But after that, there were no massacres of Americans.
Right.
Israelis of all walks of life, as well as the political leaders and military commanders, did not act rationally after October the 7th.
No, of
they
course not.
wanted
That's
revenge.
That's my point. So you're saying it was not motivated by professional decision making, but by vengeance and retribution
and boiling blood.
Which is understandable, by the way, but not for 16 months.
That's true.
It's understandable for 16 weeks, not 16 months. At some point, you would.
And what Biden did by holding off on this shipment of bombs was to say to Netanyahu and the IDF generals, listen, if you must go into Rafah, if you must take Rafah, Okay, but don't do it the same way you did in northern Gaza,
2,000-pound bombs.
right, softening the area before the ground forces go in, and thereby demolishing everything. What Trump is now saying, well, it all has to be taken care of, and therefore the population must leave.
Yeah, but Trump makes sense to the common man by saying Gaza is uninhabitable. But he's not speaking as a commander-in-chief. He's speaking as a realtor-in-chief. He's a real estate developer. And it sort of makes sense, even though politically it does.
And just the other day he spoke to a Saudi investment event in Miami. Much like the real estate developer that he still feels he is, he not only quoted his late father regarding how you go about contracting and constructing a building, but also said, yes, I used to sell housing units here in the area, and kept pushing his own
this is his mindset. This is how he thinks, which is why he is ill-equipped to deal with geopolitical issues. Now, but we're Israeli. I'm not giving advice to Donald Trump. I'm indirectly giving advice to Israel. Israel, for 20 years, failed to reinvent itself in terms of its value to the U.S. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying there is one topic, one issue, one policy that would serve all these ideas or goals. But right now, when Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, offers to invest $600 billion in America in the next 4 years, what can Israel offer to have a sway?
I'll tell you what Israel can offer or threaten. You remember the famous line by Arik Sharon before he was prime minister, when he was a very brash and junior general. He said, yes, it's true that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries have the oil, but we have a match which we can light.
Yeah. And then you see how the world treats Israel, and you're saying, why don't you repeat that and see
who's the pariah now?
Who's the pariah now? Who's the pyromaniac?
Right.
Not just the pariah. Yeah.
So if it's all business-like, matter-of-fact, the only path for Israel would seem to try and integrate into the region, as Biden and Blinken suggested.
Well, yes, but that's undoable and not viable under this current government. The worst mistake, I don't know what this government can do. Nothing. But I'm not giving advice to the government on what.
You mean the political constraints?
Yeah, and also the personalities. Everyone rolls off their tongue Ben Gvir and Smotrich. It's Netanyahu. But I do have one piece of advice about the don't do's. If Donald Trump in the next 6 or 7 or 8 months is convinced or was convinced by someone he trusts that Netanyahu is trying to drag him into a war with Iran, which I have no doubt that Netanyahu will try and do, because this is who he is. It's the scorpion and the frog in a new rendition. Then excuse the expression, but all hell will break loose in this relationship.
Let me support your thesis.
Please.
When referring to Zelensky a few days ago, Trump talked about the politics as he sees it in Ukraine. And he said that Zelensky is a loser, and because his public opinion poll numbers are very low, he is afraid of calling an election. This could apply to Netanyahu, too.
Absolutely. It could apply to Trump, too, but the system is different. Zelensky is more popular in the Ukraine than Trump is currently popular in the U.S., but that's beside the point. Yes, reminding you, Amir, that early on after October 7th, Trump was on record calling Netanyahu a loser. He was very impressed with what Israel did to Hezbollah, and even more impressed than what Israel did in terms of the assassinations of Nasrallah from Hezbollah, of Mash'al from Hamas in
Hania.
Of Ismail. I'm sorry, absolutely, of Ismail Hania in.
Well, if you've seen one Hamas leader, you've seen
of Ismail Hania in Tehran, and then what Israel did militarily to Tehran. He was impressed by that, but if he looks at the geopolitical terrain, the only country that has any sway, any influence on him, given who he is and what his modus operandi is Saudi Arabia, not Israel. And if he feels that Netanyahu is losing it politically, he will ditch him quickly without giving him a second thought.
But this would align with the Israeli national interest. Of course, Trump's motivation maybe coming from another angle altogether, and of course it's the American national interest, as it should be, but the Israeli interest would also be to pay the small price that the Saudis are asking for in return for normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, not under Netanyahu, but the Israeli national interest would be to have the moderates in the Arab world,
Absolutely.
including the Palestinian Authority,
Absolutely.
rule Gaza.
But like you just said a moment ago, not under Netanyahu, under a different government. A different government could come with what you just said, package it in a way that makes Trump thinks that he thought of it, and he would endorse it in a moment because it makes sense. He is, despite everything that people say about him, he's more than anything, he's a common sense guy. When he says, in order to rebuild Gaza, you have to clear the people, he thinks of a neighborhood in Queens. He thinks of ABC City in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He doesn't think about the geopolitics or the ethnic cleansing. Everyone accused him of ethnic cleansing. That's not what he meant. But you need a different government. You can't do this with Netanyahu, which is why Trump needs to be persuaded that whatever ideas he has for the Middle East, and I'm not sure he's going to have many ideas about the Middle East. He doesn't care about the Middle East.
You know, during the last stages of the campaign last year, there was an interesting clip where someone asked Steve Bannon, Trump's confidant, even though he is now clashing with Elon Musk.
Yep.
Someone asked him about Israel's value. And rather than responding directly, Bannon said that American Jews who do not support Trump are Israel's enemies, and that the true friends of Israel are the evangelicals
Sure.
and other Christians. The question is, the evangelicals are messianic. So are some of Israeli far-right extremists, such as the settlers. How do their messianics and ours coordinate, or are they on a collision course?
They are coordinated. The new American ambassador who's coming here, Mike Huckabee, is an evangelical who believes not only in Armageddon, but in God's promise to the Jewish people to give them the land in the covenant of the pieces.
But we have seen that even Marco Rubio is not a policymaker. All policy now comes from the White House.
There is no policy. All statements come from the White House. There's no policy. There's no coherent policy. Marco Rubio is almost, I'm sorry to say, it's the U.S. Secretary of State, in terms of policy, is a non-entity. He's going to dwell on Venezuela, maybe Colombia, maybe the Panama Canal, things that Trump will love to clear off his table. But in terms of China and Russia and Ukraine and the oil-rich Middle East, Marco Rubio is not a major player.
But because we are about to finish our conversation, let's have a ray of hope. Steve Witkoff, who started out as an emissary, it seemed, for special missions, but is gaining traction He went with Rubio to meet with Lavrov, Rubio, and Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor. And he seems to have Trump's complete confidence.
So did
And regarding the Gaza crisis, the hostage deal, he seems to be putting a lot of pressure on Netanyahu.
Yeah, but this is a month after the election. Let's talk in 2 months and see if he has the same level of influence. Yes, everyone in Israel who dislikes Netanyahu immediately was enchanted by Steve Witkoff, who pressured him into the deal even before Trump was president. And now the same people are very happy because they seem to think that he's pressuring Netanyahu into phase two, which I personally think will not happen, but that's beside the point. And Witkoff has the president's ear. There's no question about that.
And he doesn't have to testify on the Hill. He's not subject to congressional supervision.
He's a complete, what they call a free radical in chemistry. He's everywhere the president wants to send him, doing whatever the president
And because he's not part of the cabinet,
Right.
he's not subject to any supervision by Congress.
Technically, Congress can summon him for hearing, but the Republicans control both houses of Congress, so it's moot. But let's talk in 2 or 3 months, because the moment Trump loses interest in the Middle East, which he will, he already has, but he still blurts out a statement or so. The moment that happens and he's more into Ukraine, but then he moves on to Taiwan, but then he has a meeting with Xi Jinping, and maybe he's going to meet Kim Jong-un again, he's not going to bother himself with Hamas and Riviera.
So we will be left,
Then we'll talk about Witkoff.
So we here in Israel will be left to our own devices,
Yep.
and not all devices are exploding beepers.
Not all devices are exploding beepers, and there are two ways of looking at it. One is to say that left on their own, Israel and the Palestinians, left to their own devices, Israel and the Palestinians could never reach a deal. There needs to be an American mediation. That was then. The new conventional wisdom is do not look for the U.S. To mediate. Do not look for the U.S. to come up with new bridging formulas. This is up to us. If you recall, I know we need to end. If you recall, the first time Netanyahu met Trump in early 2017, they came out to the press and someone was screaming a question about the two states at Trump. And Trump looked and said, I talked to the prime minister, and then he did this dismissive movement with his hand and said, two state, one state, whatever they decide, I leave it to them. This is his attitude.
Them, meaning only the Israelis or the Palestinians too?
It doesn't matter.
But then in 2020, he came out with a two-state vision.
Yeah, but it was basically an arms deal called packaged very nicely, called the Abraham Accords, and other than relations with the United Arab Emirates, not much happened.
And one doubts whether Trump ever read the Trump plan for.
Well, he did. As long as we're delving into history, he did because Netanyahu, as he always does, overstretched and promised that he will bring to the cabinet next week, a day after the signing of the Abraham Accord, that he will bring to the cabinet an annexation.
I'm talking 8 months earlier, in January of 2020, when Netanyahu and Benny Gantz were in Washington to applaud the unveiling of Trump's vision for peace and prosperity between Israelis and Palestinians, including Gaza. Gaza was a major part of it. So he may lose interest.
I think he already has.
But because he has this real estate mentality, the reason he's not going to be successful mediating between Arabs and Israelis the way Jimmy Carter did, the way Bill Clinton did, is because they understood that in our real estate, the agent must pay the parties rather than the other way around.
Right.
The agent is not getting a commission. The agent is paying them. What was Camp David? But not billions of dollars for Israel and Egypt for their kind agreement to accept the peace between their countries. And that was also the Oslo and Jordan negotiation. Trump isn't going to take a penny out of his pocket.
No, of course not. Of course not. Which is why the Saudis have so much influence on him, and Netanyahu has zero influence on him.
So it all comes to money, manna from heaven.
Yeah, it does. Trump's agenda is domestic. We all know that. In terms of the world, it's China. And that, too, is not a foreign policy issue in his mind, but a domestic issue. It's about trade balances, not about spheres of influence, which is why soon his attention span will shift away from the Middle East. There's nothing in it for him. And Netanyahu, with the Iran issue, which we just discussed a moment ago, is going to move or shift from being an irritant to a clear obstacle, a liability rather than an asset.
Alon, if we were a couple of Trumps, we would have said to each other, it was a tremendous talk, wonderful, the best ever.
If we were the orange Jews.
Right. But we will only say, I will, that it was interesting, enlightening, and not the last episode
not at all.
on this
We'll have the
Pine&Oak
same
podcast.
conversation next week.
On Procast, and we will be back.
Pine&Oak.
Pine&Oak, and we. This is a threat. We will be back. Thank you, Alon.
Thank
See
you,
you
Amir.
soon.
Absolutely.